The Middle East conflict has arrived on South Africa's doorstep, and this national security failure is to blame. In recent days, the media, both in South Africa and abroad, has been abuzz with news of the flight of Palestinian asylum seekers that arrived at OR Tambo International in Johannesburg. Now, what's particularly worrying about this is the fact that, first of all, the South African government seemed to have no knowledge of what was going on. And second of all, this came just days after the Israeli government confirmed that the Secret Service had uncovered a terror network in Europe, also of people who fled the exact same region. But before we continue, could I please remind you to subscribe to the channel? It's completely free, and all you have to do is click on the subscribe button at the bottom left corner of this video. Now let's proceed. So the Prime Minister of Israel published this important press release in which it's explained that the Mossad uncovered what is called the Hamas octopus, which is a wave of exposures of terrorist infrastructure within Europe. So, following a lengthy investigation by the Mossad for intelligence and special operations, and thanks to cooperation with European intelligence and law enforcement agencies, terrorist infrastructures built by Hamas with the aim of carrying out attacks against Israeli and Jewish targets have recently been thwarted. Law and enforcement authorities in Europe, including in Germany and Austria, have conducted a series of complex counterterrorism operations, resulting in the arrest of terrorist operatives and the discovery of weapons caches intended for use by terrorist cells to harm innocent people on the day the order is given. So, if we continue down, we see the investigation of those involved revealed that the items hidden in the cache belong to Hamas operative Muhammad Naim, the son of senior Hamas political bureau member abroad, Bassem Naim, who is close to Khalil al-Khaya, the Hamas leader in the Gaza Strip. Now, for those of you who are interested in reading on, I will attach this press release in the description box below, so you can check it out for yourself. But what's really important to understand here is that this terror infrastructure has been uncovered in Europe, and it has been set up by Hamas operatives. Now, these are not people who are native Germans, native Austrians. These are people who, as this example shows, came from Gaza, where the Hamas senior leadership is, and found their way into Europe. And while, yes, it says that they focused on Israeli and Jewish installations, not only is this still completely wrong, it should not be happening, but there's no telling who else might be caught in the firing line. Let's also not forget that South Africa has its own prominent Jewish community, which needs to be shielded from such danger. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain why the story needs to be taken incredibly serious by South Africans. You see, days before its release, South Africa accepted a plane load of Gazan refugees or asylum seekers. And as we can see, this story actually hit international media, with NBC News taking note. Now, if we take a look here, what's probably the most problematic thing is that South Africa's border security had no idea what was actually going on the ground. And this is entirely problematic because South Africa's border security is the first line of defense against international threats to the country. So, as we see in this article, South Africa's intelligence services are investigating who was behind a chartered plane that landed in Johannesburg with more than 150 Palestinians from war-ravaged Gaza who did not have proper travel documents and were held on board on the tarmac for around 12 hours as a result. So as we know, the border security was not so quick to let them disembark, which I guess is an encouraging sign. They did have to wait for about 12 hours, but of course they were eventually allowed passage into the country. And what's particularly worrying is the fact that they did not have proper travel documents. And so how on earth are you supposed to know who these people are, what their backgrounds are, and if they have any affiliations with dangerous groups? So if we take a look at the president's comments, these are probably the most worrying part of the story. So South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said that there was an investigation to uncover how the Palestinians came to South Africa via a stopover in Nairobi, Kenya. These are people from Gaza who somehow mysteriously were put on a plane that passed by Nairobi and came here, Ramaphosa said, in just the most confused fashion. This is incredibly worrying to hear presidents speak in this way. The Palestinian embassy in South Africa said in a statement, the flight was arranged by an unregistered and misleading organization that exploited the tragic humanitarian conditions of our people in Gaza, deceived families, collected money from them, and facilitated their travel in an irregular and irresponsible manner. This entity later attempted to disown any responsibility once complications arose. So, those of you who've checked out other videos such as those by Ronaldo Gous and Morning Shot will know that this has been a very big controversial issue. First of all, people are not so sure who actually chartered this plane. Second of all, we don't know the exact origin of the organization, and we don't know exactly which organization managed this situation, who they're tied to. There seems to be a lot of misleading and even false information on the website of Al-Majd, as it's called. And what's particularly disturbing is the fact that despite these issues, South Africa's border security decided to let these people into the country anyway. Now, of course, this poses a natural danger to the country. I'm not saying that these people are all necessarily dangerous. There could be innocent people amongst them, and perhaps they all are. But that is something that we do not know for sure. Another thing we do not know for sure is how many of them are dangerous. And so while Ramaphosa can say that we're going to have an investigation into this matter, it's too late. The people are already in the country, and who knows what actions they are already taking. But this should be no surprise, because if we look at the ties that South Africa has to Hamas already, it's pretty concerning. So the Foundation of Defensive Democracies released this report in which it investigated the deep ties between Hamas and South Africa. Now, just for some context, the FDD is a Washington, D.C. based nonpartisan research institute, and their focus is on national security and foreign policy. Now, what's really interesting about them is that in addition to being nonpartisan, they've actually shared their expertise with the Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. And so this is a highly esteemed organization that works directly with the presidency in the United States. And so they are to be taken seriously. Now, if we take a look at the investigation itself, we see how there's been decades of ANC support for Hamas. So shortly after Hamas won Palestinian parliamentary elections in 2006, which is the only elections that have ever been held in Gaza, by the way, the ANC-led South Africa became one of the few countries to forge ties with the Hamas-led Palestinian government. ANC officials still regularly host and meet with high-level delegations from Hamas. Now, it is very important to note here that they are understanding that the FDD is acknowledging that this is the ANC who is at fault for this, not the South African country as a whole. And that's good, because it shows that they understand who the culprits are and who needs to be held to account. It's not fair to hold other people to account when they have nothing to do with it and are in fact largely opposed to the ANC's actions. So nearly a decade later, in 2015, ANC leaders welcomed senior Hamas leaders Khaled Mashal and Musa Abu Marzouk for the signing of a letter of intent aimed at strengthening ties between the two groups. And so here we go. ANC is attempting to get closer to Hamas. While in South Africa, Mashal spoke at an ANC-organized conference and promised that Hamas would continue its wave of Jerusalem Intifada attacks against Israel. 3 years later, in 2018, the group signed a memorandum of understanding to advance the international boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel. The ANC also committed to working in South Africa's parliament to downgrade its embassy in Israel. And then, as we know, that vote was carried out. A lot of the opposition parties, such as the DA, Freedom Front Plus, ACDP, and IFP, opposed this notion, but of course the ANC held the majority at the time, so it got passed. We then saw how soon after the October 7th attacks, the South African government under the ANC decided to shut down its embassy in Israel. What's particularly concerning is the fact that just 10 days after the October 7th attacks, and this is before Israel began its ground incursion into Gaza, by the way, we saw that South Africa's then Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, spoke by phone with Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. She said that the purpose of the call was to discuss humanitarian aid in Gaza, and soon after, in December 2023, members of a Hamas delegation, including Emad Saber, Bassem Naim and Khaled Khadoumi, met with senior members of the ANC at the party's headquarters. Remember, that's in the heart of Johannesburg. The General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Solly Mapaila, also participated. What's important to note is that Pandor actually had a US visa revoked a few days ago, so clearly the US is onto her. But unfortunately, the ANC's misdeeds did not stop there. Then, in January 2024, South African ambassador to Qatar, Ghulam Hussein Asmal, himself a member of the ANC, met with and received a formal letter of appreciation from representatives of the Popular Conference for Palestinians Abroad, a group that Israel designated in 2022 as a Hamas proxy, and so therefore a terror organization by association. The letter praised South Africa's lawfare against Israel at the ICJ. The letter was presented on the same day that Asmal met with a delegation of Palestinian families whose relatives included martyrs, prisoners, and wounded individuals. And we know that martyrs can have a pretty broad definition, including those Hamas members who were defeated in fighting. So as we can see here, the Hamas ties with the ANC are indisputable. We've also seen how Imtiaz Suleiman of Gift of the Givers is deeply embedded in the ANC and has high influence over their foreign policy, as I've picked out in my previous video on the matter. And what's particularly worrying above all else is that Israel has actually managed to uncover terror networks and activities being carried out in Europe where Palestinians have been exported to. And now we see them coming here. So this video isn't to cause unabated alarm and panic. It's to show people the reality of what's actually going on. You see, for the longest time, South Africa has had a massive amount of problems, such as crime and unemployment. But one issue that South Africa has never had to deal with is terrorism. But now that could all change. Again, I'm not saying that the people on that Palestinian flight were all necessarily bad, and perhaps none of them are. But the problem is that we do not have the intelligence at our fingertips to make that determination. We've allowed these people into the country, and now South Africa's security is at risk. Thank you very much for tuning into this video. If you found it informative, please remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.